November 5th, 1975. Quifangondo, Angola. Coronel Raul Diaz Arguelles watched the South African armored column through his binoculars, counting the Elan 90 armored cars advancing through the savannah dust. His 82nd Battalion had arrived from Havana just 48 hours earlier, barely time to acclimatize to the African heat, let alone prepare defensive positions. Behind him, 652 Cuban soldiers, most in their early 20s, many who had never fired a shot in combat, dug foxholes in the rust-colored earth. They had 120mm mortars, recoilless rifles, and orders to hold this position 13 miles from Luanda at all costs. The South Africans didn't know Cubans were here. Neither did the Americans, whose satellite intelligence had somehow missed the Soviet An-22 transport planes landing Cuban troops at Luanda Airport for the past 2 weeks. The apartheid forces expected to face only the poorly trained fighters of the Angolan MPLA, Marxist guerrillas, not professional soldiers. They expected to enter Luanda, Angola's capital, within hours. They expected to install their preferred faction before Angola's Independence Day at midnight. Diaz Arguelles checked his watch. 1,400 hours. In 10 hours, Angola would become independent from Portugal. In 10 hours, the outcome of this battle would determine whether a Marxist, pro-Cuban government or a South African-backed regime would control one of Africa's richest nations. In 10 hours, a small Caribbean island's foreign policy gamble would either succeed spectacularly or end in catastrophic defeat 6,000 miles from home. He couldn't know that this moment would launch the largest and longest military intervention in Cuban history. An intervention that would eventually send over 375,000 Cuban soldiers to Africa across 15 years, fundamentally alter the Cold War in the Third World, and contribute to the downfall of apartheid itself. In Havana, Fidel Castro had made his decision in early November 1975 with characteristic boldness and almost no consultation with Moscow. "We have a moral duty," he told his military commanders. Angola fought for their independence. Now the South Africans and CIA are trying to steal it. Cuba would send combat troops, not advisors, not trainers, but actual fighting battalions, to defend the MPLA government before it could even take power. The decision shocked Castro's own advisors. Cuba was a small island nation of 9 million people, still recovering from the economic devastation of the U.S. embargo, located 6,000 miles from Angola across the Atlantic. The Soviet Union had ships and transport capacity. Cuba had revolutionary fervor and recent combat experience. "We're not asking for Soviet permission," Castro reportedly told his brother Raul, Minister of Defense. "We're informing them." In Moscow, the Politburo received news of Castro's unilateral decision with a mixture of surprise and grudging admiration. Leonid Brezhnev hadn't authorized this intervention. Castro had simply acted. But the opportunity was obvious. Angola had offshore oil, strategic minerals, and a long Atlantic coastline. As KGB Chief Yuri Andropov noted in a November meeting, "The Cubans are doing what we should have done ourselves, but cannot be seen doing." The Soviets would provide the airlift, the weapons, the political cover. The Cubans would provide the blood. American intelligence initially dismissed reports of Cuban combat troops as impossible. The Cubans don't have the capability to project force to Africa, a CIA assessment from early November concluded. Any involvement will be limited to medical personnel and advisors. The Ford administration, distracted by the aftermath of Vietnam and Watergate, considered Angola a sideshow, a minor proxy conflict in a backwater nation. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger focused on détente with Moscow and opening to China. Angola wasn't worth a confrontation. This miscalculation would prove catastrophic for American credibility in Africa. As Kissinger later admitted in his memoirs, "We failed to take seriously Castro's willingness to conduct an independent foreign policy And we failed to grasp that African nationalism might welcome Cuban soldiers as liberators rather than reject them as communist agents. South African military intelligence suffered from even more catastrophic assumptions rooted in racial supremacy. Black African soldiers cannot stand against the SADF. Read one pre-operation assessment from November 1975. The South African Defense Force, battle-hardened from years of bush war in Namibia and supremely confident in their equipment superiority, expected their Zulu column to sweep aside MPLA resistance and capture Luanda in days. The possibility of encountering professional, well-trained Cuban forces equipped with modern Soviet weapons wasn't seriously considered. The MPLA themselves, led by Agostinho Neto, initially viewed Cuban assistance with desperation-born gratitude. Neto's forces controlled Luanda, but faced a three-pronged assault. South African troops advancing from the south, FNLA rebels backed by Zaire and the CIA pushing from the north, and UNITA forces under Jonas Savimbi pressuring from the east. Without the Cubans, there would be no independent Angola. Neto told his commanders. There would only be a South African puppet state. The Cubans arrived, believing they were fulfilling both moral obligation and strategic opportunity. As one Cuban officer wrote in his diary, "We are fighting the same white supremacists who support our enemies in Miami, the same imperialism that invaded Playa Girón. But this time, we have the advantage. This time, we choose the battlefield." The roots of Cuban intervention in Africa stretched back to the early 1960s, long before Angola. Che Guevara's vision of revolutionary internationalism, exporting Cuba's revolution to the developing world, had driven Cuban involvement in anti-colonial struggles across Africa since 1961. Cuban doctors, teachers, and military advisors operated in newly independent Algeria, Congo, and Guinea-Bissau throughout the 1960s. By 1975, Cuba had accumulated 15 years of experience in African operations. But Angola was different. Angola represented the last major Portuguese colony in Africa, and its independence, scheduled for November 11, 1955, triggered a vicious civil war among three liberation movements. The MPLA, Marxist, urban-based, supported by the Soviet Union and Cuba. The FNLA, backed by the United States and Zaire. And UNITA, initially Maoist, then shifting to American and South African support under Savimbi. The Cuban connection to the MPLA began in 1965, when Neto visited Havana seeking support. Castro, impressed by the MPLA's anti-colonial struggle and Marxist orientation, provided weapons, training, and advisors. By 1975, approximately 480 Cuban military advisors operated in Angola, a substantial presence, but still just advisors. Everything changed in October 1975, when South African mechanized columns invaded Angola from Namibia, then called Southwest Africa, a territory South Africa controlled in defiance of UN mandates. Operation Savannah, the South African invasion, deployed tanks, armored cars, artillery, and 3,000 combat troops. The objective? Capture Luanda before Independence Day and install a FNLA-UNITA coalition government friendly to Pretoria. In Havana, Castro watched the intelligence reports with growing alarm. His advisors in Angola sent urgent cables. The MPLA was collapsing, South African armor was advancing unopposed, Luanda would fall within weeks. Castro called an emergency meeting on November 4, 1975. "How fast can we deploy a battalion?" he asked his military staff. 48 hours to Angola," came the answer, "if the Soviets provide the airlift." Castro made his decision immediately. Deploy the Special Forces Battalion now. Send everything else we can spare. We cannot let the apartheid regime install a puppet government in Luanda. The operation received the codename Carlota, honoring a slave woman who led a rebellion against plantation owners in 19th century Cuba, a name deliberately chosen to emphasize the anti-colonial, anti-racist character of the mission. Between November 7th and November 27th, 1975, Soviet An-22 transport aircraft flew 36 missions from Havana to Luanda, carrying 4 Cuban infantry battalions, artillery units, and anti-aircraft batteries, approximately 1,500 combat troops. It was the largest military airlift in Cuban history, accomplished with minimal publicity and maximum speed. The Soviet role was critical but carefully calibrated. Moscow provided transportation and weapons, but no Soviet combat troops. As Soviet Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov explained to Brezhnev, "Let the Cubans fight. They are better suited for this. Tropical climate, no racial barrier, genuine revolutionary commitment. We provide logistics, they provide blood." American intelligence didn't detect the Cuban deployment until November 14th, a full week after the first troops landed. Even then, the CIA estimated only 200 to 300 advisors, not combat battalions. The intelligence failure stemmed from multiple sources. Satellite coverage focused on Soviet shipping, not Cuban airports. Human intelligence networks in Angola had collapsed during the Civil War, and institutional bias insisted Cubans couldn't mount such an operation. By Independence Day, November 11, 1975, Cuban troops held defensive positions at Quifangondo, blocking the southern approach to Luanda. When South African forces attacked on November 10th, they encountered not disorganized guerrillas, but prepared defensive positions, coordinated artillery fire, and soldiers who stood their ground. The Battle of Quifangondo lasted 8 hours. The South Africans withdrew, their advance halted 13 miles from the capital. Agostinho Neto declared Angola's independence in Luanda as scheduled, with Cuban troops ensuring the capital remained in MPLA hands. The initial gamble had succeeded, but it was only the beginning. January-March 1976, Bridge at Ebo and the Southern Offensive. The battles that defined Cuba's intervention came during the Southern Offensive of early 1976, when Cuban and Angolan forces drove South African troops back across 600 miles of territory in one of Africa's most stunning military reversals. On January 23, 1976, at the Ebo River Bridge in Benguela Province, Cuban and MPLA forces confronted a South African defensive position blocking the road north. The South Africans held higher ground, had artillery support, and controlled the only bridge across the river. Cuban commander Major Raul Menendez Tomasevich faced a tactical nightmare. Frontal assault across exposed ground against entrenched positions. "We studied the South African positions for 3 days," Tomasevich recalled. "They were confident, too confident. They expected us to attack directly across the bridge. Instead, we sent engineers downstream at night to construct a pontoon crossing." The battle began at 0430 hours with a coordinated artillery barrage, Cuban 120 mm howitzers and BM-21 rocket launchers saturating South African positions. Under cover of the barrage, Cuban infantry crossed the pontoon bridge while a diversionary force made noise at the main bridge. By 0800 hours, Cuban forces had flanked the South African position. By noon, the South Africans were retreating. "We captured 6 armored vehicles, ammunition, and food supplies," a Cuban after-action report noted. More importantly, we captured their confidence. They realized they were facing professional soldiers, not militia. The psychological impact extended beyond the battlefield. In Pretoria, South African Prime Minister John Vorster faced a political crisis. White South African casualties were mounting, officially 61 dead, though Cuban intelligence estimated higher. And the intervention was becoming public knowledge despite government censorship. Vorster faced the dilemma that would plague South Africa for the next 12 years. How to maintain apartheid's regional dominance when facing an enemy willing to match force with force. The Americans watched with growing alarm. In Washington, the State Department's Africa Bureau sent urgent cables to Kissinger. Cuban intervention changing military balance in Angola. FNLA collapsing. UNITA retreating to southeast. MPLA consolidating control with Cuban support. Kissinger faced his own constraints. Congress, scarred by Vietnam, passed the Tunney Amendment in December 1975, explicitly prohibiting further covert operations in Angola. American support to the FNLA and UNITA evaporated overnight. As Kissinger complained in a January 1976 meeting, "We're being outmaneuvered by Castro in Africa while we sit paralyzed." By February 1976, Cuban troop strength reached approximately 12,000. The mission expanded from defending Luanda to securing the entire country. Cuban forces pushed south along the coast, capturing the key port cities of Lobito and Benguela. They pushed east along the Benguela Railway, reopening Angola's strategic transport corridor. They established defensive positions along the Namibian border, blocking future South African incursions. The Battle of São Salvador in mid-February destroyed the FNLA as a military force. Cuban artillery and BM-21 rocket launchers devastated FNLA positions north of Luanda, while Cuban infantry, many veterans of guerrilla warfare, excelled at bushfighting. FNLA leader Holden Roberto fled to Zaire. The Northern Front collapsed completely. In March 1976, South African forces withdrew entirely from Angola, falling back across the Namibian border. Pretoria claimed a strategic withdrawal, but the reality was clear. South Africa had been militarily defeated. For the first time since World War II, South African forces had been forced to retreat by African soldiers, even if those soldiers were Caribbean. "We came to Angola as advisors," one Cuban officer wrote to his family. "We became an army. We came to defend Luanda. We ended up liberating half a country. We came expecting to stay 3 months. We stayed 13 years." The military success concealed deeper complexities. Cuban casualties approached 300 dead by mid-1976. A significant number for a small nation, though carefully downplayed in Havana. Equipment losses, especially vehicles destroyed by South African artillery, strained Cuban logistics. Most critically, victory transformed a short-term intervention into long-term occupation. The MPLA government, now secure in power, requested Cuban troops remain as guarantors against South African return. Castro agreed, though he insisted on reciprocal commitments. Angola would provide basing rights, support Cuban operations elsewhere in Africa, and align with Cuba in international forums. The patron-client relationship was less clear than it appeared. 1976, 1987. From liberation force to occupying army. The initial Cuban victory triggered a decade-long evolutionary process that transformed Cuba's role in Africa, South Africa's regional strategy, and the nature of Cold War proxy conflicts in the developing world. American adaptation. The Carter administration, 1907-1981, attempted diplomatic engagement with Cuba over Angola, hoping to negotiate Cuban withdrawal as part of broader normalization. "We can't condemn Cuban intervention in Angola without acknowledging our own history in Vietnam," Carter's UN ambassador Andrew Young argued. Secret talks in 1977-78 explored linkage between Cuban withdrawal from Angola and progress on Namibian independence. The talks collapsed over fundamental disagreements. Cuba insisted on South African withdrawal from Namibia as a precondition. South Africa demanded Cuban withdrawal from Angola first. The linkage problem, connecting Angolan and Namibian issues, would plague negotiations for a decade. The Reagan administration, 1981-1989, abandoned engagement for confrontation. Reagan's doctrine of rollback, actively supporting anti-communist insurgencies, made Angola a priority target. The CIA provided sophisticated weaponry to UNITA, including FM-92 Stinger missiles that neutralized Cuban air superiority. American military aid to UNITA reached approximately $15 to $30 million annually by 1985. Reagan's Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, Chester Crocker, developed constructive engagement with South Africa, attempting to use American leverage to negotiate a regional settlement. Critics called it appeasement of apartheid. Crocker insisted, "We can't isolate Pretoria while simultaneously asking them to withdraw from Namibia. We need carrots and sticks." Soviet calculations, Moscow's relationship with Cuba's African adventure remained complicated. The Soviets provided weapons, ammunition, transport, and approximately $1 billion annually in military aid by the mid-1980s. But Soviet generals expressed private frustration at Cuban operational independence. Castro runs his own show in Angola. Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov complained to the Politburo in 1983. "He doesn't ask our permission, he informs us of his decisions. He treats Soviet military advisors as equals, not superiors." The dynamic reflected broader Soviet-Cuban tensions. Cuba wanted Soviet support but refused Soviet control. Castro's foreign policy served Cuban interests, revolutionary prestige, training ground for Cuban military, leverage in negotiations with Washington, not just Moscow's agenda. Soviet military advisors deployed to Angola numbered approximately 1,000 to 2,500 throughout the 1980s, providing technical expertise, intelligence, and planning support. But Cuban commanders maintained operational control. When Soviet advisors suggested tactics, Cubans listened politely and made their own decisions. South African counter-strategy Pretoria's response evolved through three phases: shock, 1976-1978, adaptation, 1978-1983, and escalation, 1983-1987. The shock phase saw intense debate within South African military and political leadership. How had Cuban forces defeated the SADF? The answer combined tactical factors: Cuban artillery superiority, better intelligence, willingness to accept casualties, with strategic factors. Cuba had no domestic constituency demanding withdrawal, while white South African casualties generated political pressure. The adaptation phase saw South Africa develop new tactics for the Bush War. Instead of conventional mechanized columns, SADF forces emphasized special operations, air power, and support to UNITA. South African Mirage fighters and helicopter gunships provided fire support to UNITA offensives. Special Forces units conducted cross-border raids against SWAPO, Southwest Africa People's Organization, camps in Angola, accepting Cuban presence as a constraint but not a deterrent. South African Defense Minister Magnus Malan articulated the strategy in 1982. "We cannot occupy Angola. The Cubans make that impossible. But we can prevent Angola from becoming stable. We can support UNITA, keeping the MPLA government under pressure, forcing the Cubans to garrison cities rather than project power into Namibia." The escalation phase began in 1983-84. When South African forces launched increasingly ambitious incursions into Angola, sometimes penetrating 150-200 miles north of the border. These operations aimed to destroy SWAPO bases. Namibian independence fighters used Angola as sanctuary, and demonstrate that Cuban presence couldn't fully protect Angolan territory. A December 1983 South African operation captured the town of Kahama in southern Angola, holding it for several weeks before withdrawing. Cuban forces, spread thin across Angola's vast territory, couldn't respond effectively to multiple simultaneous incursions. Cuban military evolution. Cuban forces in Angola peaked at approximately 52,000 troops in 1988, with additional forces deployed to Ethiopia, 12,000 to 16,000 during the Ogaden War of 1977-78. The scale represented an extraordinary commitment for a nation of 10 million people. The Angolan experience transformed the Cuban military. Soldiers rotated through Angola on 2-year deployments, creating a generation of combat veterans. Cuban armor tactics, artillery coordination, air defense systems, all evolved through trial and error in African combat. Cuban engineers became legendary for their skills, building roads, bridges, and defensive positions across Angola. Cuban doctors staffed hospitals from Luanda to Huambo. Cuban teachers educated Angolan students. The intervention encompassed not just military force, but comprehensive state-building support. Yet problems emerged. Equipment deterioration in tropical conditions, supply line vulnerabilities, racial tensions between lighter-skinned Cubans and darker-skinned Angolans, and growing war weariness. By 1987, Cuban soldiers had died at a rate of approximately 200 to 300 per year for over a decade. Modest compared to major wars, but significant for Cuba's small population. Castro faced a dilemma: withdraw and abandon Angola to South African pressure, or escalate and risk unsustainable casualties. He chose escalation, setting the stage for the final confrontation. 1987-1988. Cuito, Cuanavale, and the battle that ended apartheid's expansion. The climactic battle occurred at Cuito, Cuanavale, a remote Angolan town near the headwaters of the Cuito River in southeastern Angola. Between August 1987 and March 1988, South African forces supported by UNITA attempted to capture this strategic position. Cuban forces, dramatically reinforced by Castro's decision to send an additional 15,000 troops, held the town through siege conditions and fierce fighting. The South African offensive began well. In August-September 1987, combined SADF-UNITA forces pushed MPLA troops back across southern Angola, inflicting heavy casualties. By November, South African commanders believed Cuito, Cuanavale would fall within weeks, opening a path to Angola's central plateau. Castro responded with characteristic boldness, sending not just reinforcements, but changing the mission. "We're not just defending anymore," he told his commanders. "We're going to threaten Southwest Africa itself. Let's see how Pretoria likes having Cuban tanks near their border." Between December 1987 and March 1988, Cuba deployed approximately 15,000 additional troops, 50 T-55 tanks, modern MiG-23 fighters, and multiple air defense systems. The reinforcements didn't just reinforce Cuito, Cuanavale. They deployed west, threatening South African positions in occupied Namibia. The siege of Cuito, Cuanavale saw the most intense combat of the entire war. South African G5 and G6 artillery pounded Cuban and Angolan positions daily. Cuban 120 mm and 130 mm batteries returned fire. Casualties mounted on both sides. Cuban losses approached 300 dead between December 1987 and March 1988. South African casualties, officially listed as 31 killed, likely reached higher numbers. General Arnaldo Ochoa, commanding Cuban forces, described the pressure. "We had South African artillery hitting us from long range, their air force bombing our positions, UNITA attacking our supply lines. But we held. Every day we held was a political victory." The military stalemate produced political breakthrough. In March 1988, as Cuban forces massed near the Namibian border, South African commanders faced nightmare scenarios. What if Cuba invaded Namibia? What if MiG-23s struck South African bases? What if casualties escalated beyond what white South African public opinion would accept? In Pretoria, President P.W. Botha authorized negotiations. The combination of military stalemate, economic sanctions, and Cuban threat to escalate forced South Africa's hand. As South African Chief of the Defense Force General Jannie Geldenhuys later admitted, "We could have taken Cuito, Cuanavale with additional forces. But the Cubans had changed the strategic picture. They threatened Namibia itself. We had to negotiate. The New York Accords, signed in December 1988, provided for Cuban withdrawal from Angola over 27 months, South African withdrawal from Namibia, Namibian independence under UN supervision, end to South African support for UNITA Castro, claimed total victory. We defeated the apartheid army. We secured Angola's independence. We made Namibian freedom possible. Cuban blood watered African liberation. South African government statements emphasized achieved objectives and successful negotiations. But Pretoria's regional dominance was broken. The myth of SADF invincibility lay shattered. American diplomats, particularly Chester Crocker, who mediated the negotiations, claimed credit for the diplomatic process. The reality was more complex. American mediation mattered, but Cuban military pressure created conditions for negotiation. The immediate impact was measurable. Namibia achieved independence in 1990. South African security forces withdrew from Angola. The regional balance shifted decisively against apartheid. Within South Africa itself, the military failure contributed to reform pressures. In February 1990, F.W. de Klerk released Nelson Mandela and began negotiating apartheid's end. The connection wasn't simple causation. Internal anti-apartheid resistance deserves primary credit for ending apartheid. But Cuban intervention contributed. It demonstrated that apartheid's military power had limits. It emboldened African resistance movements. It isolated South Africa diplomatically. And it showed that African liberation struggles could defeat white minority rule. The final Cuban soldier left Angola in May 1991, completing a 16-year intervention that cost Cuba approximately 2,077 dead, billions of dollars in economic resources, and incalculable political capital. Yet in Havana, Castro declared the mission an unqualified success. We did what no other small nation has done. We changed history in another continent. The legacy is complex and contradictory. Cuba demonstrated that small nations could pursue independent foreign policies despite superpower opposition, though only with Soviet logistical support. The intervention revealed Cold War conflicts as genuinely multipolar. Not just US-Soviet competition, but independent actors pursuing their own agendas, sometimes aligned with superpowers, sometimes independent of them. For Africa, Cuban intervention contributed to decolonization's final phase. Namibian independence, Zimbabwe's liberation struggle, and ultimately apartheid's collapse all occurred in contexts shaped partly by Cuban military presence. Whether Africans viewed Cubans as liberators or as another form of foreign intervention remains debated. Many Angolans resented Cuban military occupation, others genuinely appreciated Cuban sacrifice. The intervention transformed Cuba itself. The military gained combat experience and professional competence. Cuban international prestige peaked. But economic costs, subsidized by Soviet aid, contributed to Cuba's economic vulnerability when Soviet support collapsed in 1991. Within 5 years of victory in Angola, Cuba entered its special period of economic crisis. For American foreign policy, Angola represented failure. The inability to counter Cuban intervention, the weakness of covert support to proxies, the constraints imposed by post-Vietnam congressional oversight. Reagan-era support to UNITA continued through 1991, but without reversing MPLA control. Perhaps most significantly, Cuban intervention revealed the Cold War's moral complexities. Cuba fought alongside Marxist authoritarian regimes while claiming to represent liberation. South Africa defended minority white rule while claiming to resist communism. The United States supported anti-communist guerrillas while indirectly aligning with apartheid. The USSR provided weapons while exploiting Cuban sacrifice for Soviet interests. The fundamental dynamic was neither simple anti-colonialism nor straightforward Cold War proxy conflict, but something more complex. Revolutionary nationalism, great power competition, racial politics, and genuine ideological commitment intertwined in ways that defied easy categorization. When Colonel Diaz-Arguelles returned to Havana in 1989 after his third deployment to Angola, he reflected. We went to Africa because we believed in something larger than Cuba. We stayed because withdrawal meant betrayal. We fought because the alternative was watching apartheid triumph. Whether it was worth the cost, that's for history to judge. But we did what we thought was right. History's judgment remains contested. But the facts are clear. 50,000 Cuban soldiers fought in Africa, and their intervention helped end apartheid's regional expansion. That small Caribbean island changed the trajectory of a continent remains one of the Cold War's most improbable stories.